Suspiciously quiet in here. So because I'm super lazy? No. Because I think it's a good idea to do hands-on stuff and take a break from just sitting up here and talking through things. I wanted to a little bit from where we're just talking through stuff and spend more time today trying to work in groups, but also work on how to think about breaking down problems so that we can compose them. So there's a great page up there on the React documentation. Don't go there just yet if you're following along, because I want us to try and work through this a little bit together at first. But it's called Thinking in React. So they've got a great, like, if you're paying attention and you go to this site, you'll be like, wait a minute, she's almost followed along with the path of this these concepts so far. So little foreshadowing, we're going to be hitting state and life cycle pretty soon. And I may talk about that stuff a little bit today, later in class, depending on how long we spend sort of breaking stuff down in this Thinking in React example. But I wanted to jump down to Thinking in React so that we start this process, and as we're looking at any problems that we're tackling, we're using this sort of approach to our thought process. And this goes back to a lot of what I emphasized last class, saying what I think is one of the most important concepts in like programming. Does anybody remember? Yeah, working with abstractions. And so that's really what this is trying to teach you, is how useful ways to break stuff apart so that you can have those abstractions. And I tend to think that React makes it really easy to do some of this, or a lot easier than some other tools. So we're going to start off going through their example, and then I've got several other ones that I'll pull up and have sort of visible up here. I'll ask people when we do that to maybe break up into small groups, 2 or 3 people, for a period of time and try and talk about how you might break that down into different pieces that you would build something out of, right? Which will make a lot more sense after we go through this sort of first one together. So let's just start walking through some of this. So this says, imagine that we already have a JSON API and you guys haven't worked. Anyone know what JSON means? So it just means JavaScript object notation. So if I scroll down a little bit here, I'm gonna look at this. JSON is just a way of sending data that looks a lot like JavaScript. So this is just, hey, this looks familiar. This is an array of objects. And each object has certain properties, right? This is very commonly the type of data that you'll get back when you're talking to a backend API. A lot of times they've got different formats, but JSON formatted data is one of the really common ways of working with data. So something like this, a lot of times is what you'll get if, as we talked about with Daisy, like you made a request to the Pinterest API. There's a good chance that you'll be able to get back JSON and work with it. Now, it might be a lot more complex and structured than this, a lot more going on. Let me take a quick check. I don't know. They may not let me on because logged in to go to their site. They're like, no, we hate you. Log in. So they've got something very similar. And if we go and just start reading, I don't know what I'm doing here. I've never been on it. But we take a look at some of this. Maybe we'll be able to get down here a little bit. And here's an example response. I think we can all say with a fair amount of certainty that just looks like another bit of JSON or JavaScript, right? Like if we were to look at this, that's an object which has a couple properties on it of data and page. And data is an array, which looks like it only has one entry in it, which is an object. And page is an object with a couple properties, cursor and next, and so on, right? So it might be intimidating if you first look at it, but if you break it down piece by piece, it's not that bad. That's the same thing we're talking about here. So going back to our thinking in React, if we have data structured like this, which isn't that talking about.
Sort of like standard.
It's a very, yes, I would say that there's not one, everybody uses this data format. Another popular way of sending data is XML formatted. And XML is, it looks more like HTML. So this is very, like JSON became popular because it's very basic. There's not a lot of markup and stuff sort of cluttering up the pieces of data that you're looking for. Whereas like, if we're looking for an XML example instead, and this might be really simple because it'll be a simple XML file, but XML, see, it looks a lot more like, almost like HTML. But that's another popular format. Now, the great thing about stuff that's formatted using JSON is it gives you a huge hint. It says JavaScript object notation. So you can take that data straight from the API and just assign it to a JavaScript variable most of the time and start working with it with almost no extra conversion steps in between. So it's really nice when you get that, but it's not the only way that people make their data available. Anyways, yeah, let's go back up and look at, so let's say that we've got this mock-up from our designer as well, right? And what we want to do is, it's our job as developers to turn this mock-up into code. So we want to take this and figure out, all right, how are we going to write the code to make this a reality? Does anyone want to, like, there's no right or wrong. Anyone want to take a guess? How would you do it? Where would you start? What would you do to try and turn this mock-up into code? You can say anything. It's okay. Yeah.
I would like to begin with like naming each object, so it's like price, set the value to it, maybe the wall, set the value to that.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way, right? Like maybe you just start by directly writing some HTML and stuff, and so you just do that. Or maybe you, so there's a lot of ways to tackle this, right? You could look at this as one whole thing. Okay, I'm just starting to write a page, and I'm going to put an input box up here, and I'm going to write this out, and then I'm going to have a checkbox field with some text, and I'm going to have some bold items, right? Any other thoughts on how you might tackle it? Yeah?
So we can use the JSON format, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, that gives you some hint about what the data is like, and that might help you think about how to tackle the, how you would build out your UI. Because let's say that that's how you get your data, right? That's what's populating it.
But things like, I think one different thing that we have to think about is like when we use this code, because you have like two categories over there, like sporting goods is a category, and you have football, baseball, basketball, and electronics is another one. So I don't know. I mean, if it's only that, it's a thing that you have to.
That's great. So we're starting to.
About that, it's I don't know. What's the use of this thing? I mean,
We said we might want to reuse stuff, right? Like.
Yeah.
Maybe we want to reuse things. So what were some of the pieces that look like they were reused or repeated in this? Maybe we had categories.
Mm-hmm.
Category
For name, price.
is something, right? Name, price.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
two totally separate things going on with the search at the top and then the stuff down below. So I would definitely want to break those apart.
We've got this search section up at the top that feels different, right? I think that's a great point. It feels like it's something different than the rest of it, although connected, related, right?
Yeah, and the checkbox, because it's only show products in stock, so you're thinking that there would be some products that would be out of stock, so there would be some counter somewhere that you will need.
Right.
That one was in the JSON, right? It's true.
Yeah, we did have that, right? It tells you whether it's stocked or not, which is great. So, I mean, I love it. This is like whenever you, as a developer, are trying to figure out how to build something like this, you know, we're doing front end, we're doing React, so this is the type of work that we're doing. A lot of times you'll get a design like this. It might be much worse than this. It might literally be a napkin, you know, which is fine, or somebody's sketch. And it doesn't matter if it's this high of fidelity. Oh, so if it's this close or not, you can start thinking about how you want to break it down. So let's walk through a little bit of how they break stuff down. And mind you, this is far from the only way to do it, but it's a really good example of how to think about these types of things. And then, you know, I've got their code running as well over on this other page, and we can talk about how that works, right? So you don't have to do it the exact same way, but you know, they say the first thing you want to do is draw boxes around every component and subcomponent in the mock and give them all names, right? And we're sort of starting to give some stuff names a little bit here. But the question there is, and this comes through experience and through sort of practice, is how do you know what should be a component? How do you know what makes sense as something to be reused in some way or whatever? And there's a lot of different ways to break it apart. They talk about something known as the single responsibility principle, which gets back to what was being said, that it feels like this search here does something different, right? Like that's different than the rest of it. It may be related, but not the exact same thing. So it feels like that has a different responsibility than this list or something, right? And so that's getting into this notion that like a component should ideally do like one thing. Try not to make them super complex where they're doing a lot of things. Instead, what we're going to want to do is compose something more complex from smaller components that we build it out. And they even, a guy was saying, sort of hint at it. They say, often you're displaying a JSON data model to a user. Oops. And you'll find that if your model was built correctly, which is not always the case, then your UI will sort of map to it, right? So we get some things that maybe map to our UI. But then we have this, which I think is a really nice breakdown. So what they've done is outline these different pieces of the app, if you want to think about it that way, right? And these could all be, let me scroll back up a minute. You know, these could all have different names. It doesn't matter what their names are. So we could give them names if we chose for the different pieces. Now what they chose is for this top level, the whole thing, if you will, they just called it a filterable product table. Like that's sort of encapsulating all of this. And that makes sense, you know, it's a little verbose, a little long, but you know, it works for a name because it sort of describes what it's doing. It's a table, it shows products, it's filterable. That makes sense? And then we break it down even more, right? And we start breaking down these other pieces. So then they have, okay, they've got the search bar, which is sort of all of this user input. And you could easily break that down as the search input and then this checkbox as separate things, because they don't have to be all one element. Then what we've got here is this product table, right? That's a table of everything that we have. But our product table is broken into, you know, we've got these category headlines up here, but then we also have these categories, or what do they call it? Product category row. So that's describing the category and then putting everything in there. And then you have like a product row for each item. So again, like I said, this is not the only way you could have broken this down into thinking about it as building blocks. This is just one way, but it's a great example of taking what we had at the beginning and breaking it down into these pieces. Abstraction of some kind that lets us then build stuff out without having to think about the details of every aspect going on inside of it. Does this make sense? Any questions about this idea, how to break something like this down, or the way that they did it? Yeah.
We assume that the orange one is going to be kind of the React DOM dot render, and then each piece kind of will get put into that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it in this context. And in fact, if we step over, so they say if you look at product table, you see that the table heading containing the name and price labels isn't its own component. This is a matter of preference, and there's an argument to be made either way, right? So they didn't make this its own component. They just left it inside of the product table. But yes, if we step over here and we look at it, this example implementation in React code, and we'll go through some of this, but maybe not all of it. I'm just trying to have it there working. What we can see is this filterable product table is exactly that, right? That's the item that we rendered in our React DOM.render call. Yep.
Would the array of the product be inside the, can you go back to the table, sorry?
Can I go back to?
Yeah, so let's say I have the array for sporting goods, and I want to give them a property like for the sport and the prize. Would that be inside the, can you go back to the code?
Yeah.
And then, can you open the product table there?
Yeah.
I just want to say something.
This is going to start getting into the complexity of what they're actually building out here, but yeah.
So where, because they don't specify the value of the array. Do you specify the value of the array like in a general way, or do you do it within the category?
So that gets into something where there's not always, there's not like a right or wrong, and a lot of times you may want to show stuff like, I think what you're saying is right here they've got categories, right? And they're just part of each product. So what we have is an array of products, and each product has a category attribute or property on it. And they're not like grouped by that. But you could, with your data originally, if you wanted to, like we could have had this done differently instead, where the data that came back, if if it was done a little differently instead, it could be more like this. So let's make 2 objects, and let's give this a property of category, sporting goods.
Going back to the rule that you said,
And then we could have each one of these items, like the sporting good items in there.
that's what I was,
Yeah.
that's what my question was.
Mhm.
So you said as a rule of thumb, if it only does one thing, you only need one thing for it, right?
Well, that you should, as a rule of thumb, there's something, it gets into a pretty complex concept for programming, but in terms of thinking about it, it's pretty easy. So it's what's known as the single responsibility principle, which basically means, and this is where there's no like clear separation when you're talking about stuff like this. Sometimes you can clearly say like, okay, that's violated that, there's too much going on. And this is just a sort of guideline for making code that's reusable and workable. But the notion is when you're building something out, like you're building out objects, you should try and have them do one thing and not a bunch of things, and then build stuff up out of objects that do one thing. So an example of that in this case, right, is you generally wouldn't want one component that both searches and renders the list items all as one thing, because it's sort of doing these two different things. You get very, very complex, and it's going to be very hard to work with. I'm trying to think of, you know, other examples of stuff like that, right? So some people have taken this really far in terms of modern architecture for code and stuff. There's something known as like microservices, which is a very popular new way to build out websites or other things. And even at the higher level, outside of like just an object, they'll have these separate, completely independent little bits of code that they deploy that do small things for their website. So an example of that might be, and it sounds weird, but Amazon may have one bit of code and all that does is hold, like, it's the cart microservice. So all it does is keep track of the items in your cart, and it doesn't do anything else. And it talks to other things to accomplish a larger task, but it just that one small thing and can be deployed completely separately from everything else. And then you may have a, you know, credit card checkout microservice that's the only thing it does. But by making it very focused on a small area, that sort of single responsibility, it helps you know when it's time to break something out, when to make something separate. And it also helps you reduce your possibility for errors, because the more code that you have in any one place, the easier it is to have a bug.
So right there, would you say that breaking it down into the two categories would have been a better idea than having it the way they do here? Like, well,
The way the data is?
yeah.
That's one that doesn't, I would say it doesn't really matter in terms of the data structure. That's not a right or wrong, because you may change the way, like, that data is sort of that managing a single responsibility, but you may change the way that you display it in different circumstances. And so you can't always be tied directly to this is exactly how the data is going to be displayed when you're working on it like that, right? Sometimes you have to just take whatever the format is that came back and convert it to something that works for the way you want to show it. And this one isn't that bad in terms of that, right? The only thing that's a little weird is the way that the categories are, that they're inside of this. Which means if we went like to that product table, like we started to look at the code that we have here. So let's walk up the code without digging into each tiny bit at first, right? Here's our data for our products, and we render a filterable product table component, and we pass in as a property to it, or an attribute, products, which just points to this products. So now if we go into our filterable table product, or product table, we can see it takes in some props. And it's very, very simple, right? It's not doing much at all. Renders a div, renders a search bar, and renders a product table, just passing props.products in as a parameter to it. So that guy has, this is thinking of like a single responsibility. Like this component has one responsibility, which is I'm just going to compose these other things and make sure that they get the pieces of data that they need. I'm not doing the computation of how to break it down. I'm not managing much more. I'm trying to do as little as possible here for the most part, right? So then if we break down a little more, we go into our search bar here. All right. Our search bar is a form. This is getting into HTML with a couple inputs, one input, and then we've got like a little paragraph with an input checkbox. And I think they put that in there just for space, just for the sake of having more space between stuff. That's hilarious. Yeah, that's why that's in there, just to give you a little space. And then just some text, right? So this is also, at this point, very simple. It's not doing much. And today, you know, maybe at the end of the day, we might add some of the behavior in that this stuff will do. But for now, I want us to focus more on thinking about how to break these pieces down, not, so I'll go back to the thinking in React bit here, right? They talk about doing this stuff in steps. And they talk about the first step is just break it down into components. But don't, when you're doing this, step 2, build a static version in React, right? That's what I'm getting at. So if you've identified components, then before you start, and we haven't talked about how to have non-static stuff in React yet, right? But it's really useful. The first pass you do, which is what we're looking at right here, is just build something out static that just takes props and passes stuff down through to render it. Because that'll help you keep it simple at first before you start adding in the ability to change state in some way. So right now, there's no way for, like, if we change stuff here, it doesn't do anything. Because we haven't added that in yet. It's sort of like what we're doing is just taking that mock, that design that we got, and converting it to the most basic way to render that with React. And then we can start thinking about how to add in states later. But I want to try and ingrain the idea of how to break stuff down and think about putting stuff together. Like, how would you break stuff down into components before we get there?
Question.
Yeah.
In that you use form, which is HTML, right?
Mhm.
You said? I'm having difficulty understanding when to think HTML and when not to think HTML. Is there like a rule of thumb that, you know, I don't know if I asked the right question or.
So the key is there's no sharp dividing line, right? Between that's why, again, going back to when we talked about JSX and saying JSX isn't HTML and JavaScript, what we should be thinking about when working with it is that we're working with components, we're working with elements, right? And yeah, when you get to the lowest level, at least with React in a browser, ultimately, you know, your components are putting in HTML elements. But it's very possible to mix all that together. So you shouldn't always be thinking like, okay, this got to HTML and I'm thinking HTML. It's all just components and building them out, because you may go like, it's very possible to go into this is going to be weird. Let's go into our product table here. And here in our table, you know, there's nothing that says you can't decide that you're going to add, I don't know if this is going to work without me mucking something up, but you can render another, like you can render a component right there as well. It's not like once you've hit HTML, you're thinking HTML. You're sort of composing them. So a good example, there is a good example actually in here because they talked about it. So this product table is a good example because we're going to see it mix two things. It's not clear from the return here. So what we have is a table which has a name and a price, right? But then we've got this rows here. So what's going into rows? It's rendering a component for each one of those rows. So you don't like go from components down to HTML, one direction or the other. You sort of mix and match, right? And so you should always be thinking about components. The HTML elements are just elements that you're building out of as well, the same way that you are any other, you know, React component or React element. Does that make sense?
It helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unrelated.
Yeah.
Where do you build class and IDs for CSS? I mean, like, just think a little bit ahead. Let's say that's a mock-up that would have some.
Mm-hmm.
components.
Oh yeah.
You do that in the answer, or I don't know. Maybe it's.
That's a great question. I'm gonna have probably a whole class where we talk about that. Where there's a lot of debate in how to style stuff in React apps. So hold on to it because maybe at the end of the day I might show some different approaches to how to do that just a little bit, and you know we'll dive into something else deeper. We'll come back to this. and look at the code a little more if people want to. But the biggest thing I wanted to do is talk about, this concept of building something out, composing something out of components in some way, right? Not getting deep into the code of how this works. So what I want to do is I want you guys to get hands-on and do the same thing, right? I don't want to be up here talking. So I've pulled together what I think are a few sites or examples or things to try and break down into components as well. So split up into groups and then try and say, like, how would this be broken down into components? So the first one, because we'll probably build something like it anyways in class, and I know this is just over here, it's not like reacting right now, is take this idea of a calculator, right? This calculator and the different areas in it and stuff, and get together with, a group of people, can be 2, more, whatever size group you want, and spend, 5-10 minutes or something trying to break this down into components, and preferably think about how some of those can be these sort of reusable components, like this, product row wasn't specific to each row. It was like this, I'll give some hints, like maybe there's a button or something, maybe there's, so go ahead and split up and try and do some of that, and work on it. I'm gonna step out for a minute. I'll be back in just a minute though.
Yeah, there were guys.
So, but each one would just be one. There would be, like, a component would be number.
No, we were talking about your and I told us like that was just the first instance, and I think there's a second one, like there's a Senate.
Yes, but no, I think each one would be like React would have a number, and you just put together. And it's 0 through.
But in sense, no, it's just.
Render it to make it.
And I'm not following.
Yes, but you wouldn't have the number of the points. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say to build it out. So. Yeah. The calculator itself. The whole thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so.
This is really simple.
I have a question, en el botoncito eso, el verde, rojo,
Yeah,
verde,
there's like,
no, amarillo.
I don't think so.
No, this is like.
I think
Create
it's.
an order.
Es una acción.
What is the name of that for you?
Big rock.
Big Buck.
Yeah, so, yes. Clear it. Positive,
It
negative.
does this.
Those are all operations.
You investigate, understand you have to just kind of come up with a mock-up. That means it's the idea, so.
Yeah.
Is it due to be something like
They're all,
this?
like, if you think about it,
Creo que hay que poner como la idea que tenemos de la
you take the number.
We don't need to do like configuration.
Clear might be.
To break down.
But I think the components would be.
Because I think we gonna start drawing boxes around what we think is.
Right. So once
So
the
we should say
final,
like numbers.
yeah, well, what is the number?
Numbers?
Or characters, numbers and characters, right?
You say like the class minus.
I guess it would be like.
Yeah.
En nombre para eso. Otro regular.
A second, and you
I think
think
it's a
two,
number.
two,
You're inputting,
or just one?
it's part of the
Then
number.
that's all.
We keep up 2 operators,
Yeah.
we keep up like the ones
Yeah.
with orange, and then you look
So we'd actually have 10.
horizontal.
Why can't you just have the
Wait.
garage?
You would think about functionality of that.
No, but you can use stone to change, oh yeah, you know what? Yeah, at least 3 by 3, you want through, you know, the 9 could be you know, because then you can change the dome.
Pensando maybe like about the civil responsibility. Cada cosa su. Or we have the numbers, they don't do anything. It's just one thing. They're prices.
That's something
Yeah,
like.
different. And then we have the display. And then we have those 3 bottles.
You also have the zero lessons.
Like the display, yeah, like you need something where to see that.
And we have then.
So you think that's
Oh,
yes. So instead of taking AP, you think like.
Because the numbers are only data like.
Right.
It's just, it's like.
Right, and you can also include AC and the plus minus and percentage.
Yeah, because I guess they're always very, we don't use it in the offer, to other operations.
It's just a standing thing.
Yeah. So what are we supposed to do, just to finish groups and?
Yeah, the same with your group communities, like that, right? But then
No, I think so.
the other operators, so the division for education have the, so you can choose.
Yeah. So the numbers.
So what would the name
Reuse.
may not be just AC thing, cleaner,
Right.
Yeah, so you start getting.
Actually, to get what like.
Calculator.
The percentage is the function size. Calculator. Tenemos 8 different components. La calculadora, la calculadora, aquí es donde les digo que hacer el don, render don. Okay, calculator, like he had a table, right? That was the
What? We only have 2, and they're both brown.
You go up and then.
I've got light brown and dark brown.
Clear, red,
What?
display, because when you heat on that AC thing.
Let me see.
He's never, because one.
We need to put everything that has like,
So you do those,
a
right?
single function by itself.
We got nothing.
Well,
I have an
that's what I
idea.
had.
Somebody's explaining.
The display of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That can be laid in there.
Yeah, like the white.
Right.
Then we have.
And minus the 0, minus the
And
here.
then we have the bottom. Each of that. And we just this one.
This is the button.
But to create different functions for this.
Yeah.
So one prop for this, another prop for this 0, this period, and another prop. And this one.
You never know, like.
No, those each functions.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be something.
I don't
That actually is all.
They have different, they do different things, even those, like the plus and the minus, they do the same thing that you do with dot. It's just to tell the calculator that you see negative numbers. That's it. You don't, what's it?
So you do
Anything like that. There's not.
I don't know how you ever make this work, but basically, I think these are the pieces. I think this is kind of it, right? Yeah, exactly.
No hay nada que esté viendo, pero
Okay, so remember the
Rocks are components. Because remember, tengo la clase pasada, porque en caso de la clase pasada.
You don't know how it works.
Like, I understand.
Wow, I have no idea.
The groups thing sirve para
Really
pensar,
know you got it.
really
Sí, en este caso sería uno,
It's saying you don't already have.
as long as they know
Yeah, that's
the
the
zero.
So that this year, we have this problem with the
Now that-
Right, but then I would
So have.
So it's saying like, if this is strike, then go ahead.
Anyway, the keys.
Because otherwise they're already.
Right.
So are the keys,
But
like,
the keys
as
are.
if it was the names?
Yeah, and you
Why
have
would it?
key 1, key 2.
Yeah. Because that's one thing where you basically try to actually happens.
Y luego
So
el
it's
key
a
1
process
para el
of
propio
starting
proceso.
from stating,
Okay.
you
But there was one that
stating.
Is this,
Acá aparece.
That would be a hard one to trigger.
Now with the number, you have just.
we would have to leave it at that first.
The one that comes to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of
So
ground.
you have key 1, key 2, whatever, that would be the name or number or key.
Right, so whatever you
Or maybe you
I would probably have a story like,
it's like,
a
we
number.
For the variables.
minus, and then you can use like this as a.
Well, no, what I would do.
Yeah, but the function is like trying to get all the you have to.
Keep adding stuff. I mean, that part would actually.
Yeah, well, this one has
Oh,
to.
yeah, like,
Because you gotta do the five.
Yeah, but within the keys,
And then,
we're gonna do.
and then what I was saying,
So
that
operators
like
would
set
be
flag.
being
So that would
keys
go to
table.
next item is
You know what I mean? Because what was it? Was it
and
row
then
table?
you would have to do something.
Was it a row
Now instead of multiplying by 10, you have to like
Heading
put
for
these
for
dots, add
category.
these dots to it. And so that would be a little tricky. You have to represent it in a little hard way, like this is an easy way to represent it.
Yeah, we should have.
But that's the.
Trade-offs.
It's not an E here. Your website's not that good.
It's the way it works.
It's a little raw. Then you have different.
All right. I'll give a couple more minutes.
Keys, number keys, operator key. Please, please.
So we need to be there too, to row and display each row, right?
Yeah. So we first need to put categories, like to keep the names.
That's what I'm saying. Numbers or one category or keys. Or keys have numbers and operators within the key.
Because like here, in this category row, it's just its only category, because here it's product. In category, this example is
Go to, and then go down to your.
it's only the names. Here, category, it's just like sorority.
We'll get some
It's what I'm saying. How many categories? The big one. Princess. Then the category. Keys, whatever.
That's right, keep going, keep going.
be wrong, well, the name of that, or the AC thing,
I'm just going, those are functions, right? Yeah, I would say.
Even if you just don't, just try to.
Yes, because like if you don't multiply, we have to press it around.
All right. Are you guys ready? So here's the, let's see if anybody wants to present time. Does any group want to like go up and talk about how you might have thought about breaking this down into components or building blocks?
I recommend this.
What?
I don't think we can. Huh? I can't. No, Cisco. No, I mean, how about you all talk about it?
So do you want, yeah, I mean, you can do it up there, you can talk up, here, whatever, but
No,
yeah,
no, I mean,
And then conversation, group conversation.
group conversation, right?
yeah.
So, who was thinking about doing a road here? Roads? Anybody?
No,
Okay, why not?
well, we want more general than that. For roads, they have numbers.
Okay,
So
so numbers,
you can enclose like in red.
numbers, okay?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So what you're saying is, I'll try and show stuff up here. This whole, all of this, or was it just 7
Just
to,
that, just that.
just 7, 8, 9?
I mean, if you want to do the whole thing, you can start there.
Why can't you do 1 through 9?
That's what we did, 0 to 9, and that would be like its own value. Number.
Some component, yeah.
Okay, 1 through 9, so that's.
Sure.
Right?
They said
Zero. 0 through 9. Who says 0 through 9? Anybody came up with? Okay. All right. All right, so we got the numbers, right? How about the AC, the plus minus percentage, and the operators on the right? What should those two be different or?
Yes. Because I guess it would be like just division, multiplication, fraction addition, those would be the operators. And then equals would be different because that's to calculate the result. And then I think she could like explain it better with
Everybody's
So,
pointing
What's
So-
the
so the mathematical operators are different.
Right here, right?
Yeah, so the mathematical operators are different in the percentage. Percentage is an actual operation, just like the clear is an actual, not like a different function. So mathematical operators is another component that we have.
a separate component?
Yeah, separate component.
We just put all the operations together
All right,
as one, as the same.
anyone else?
Where you make them like buttons, like numerical buttons and actual buttons.
Ah,
Similar to,
so it's a little bit of a different way to put it together,
okay, so what about the equal?
Right.
Are you including the equal in there also?
Yeah.
Okay, so, Judge?
No, I just want to give people a chance to try and break stuff up, right?
It's difficult to think about that like a static thing, because when I really think about it, like later, okay, like what we're doing is just like inputting some data into it, but the only that one that really do something is the equal one.
That's the trigger of all the thing that you
Not
were writing.
really, because the percentage is also.
That's the only one,
something
yeah,
on
and
that.
the AC one.
Yeah,
but-
that's what I'm saying.
But the rest of it, like the dot or,
It's just an input.
they're just,
about-
yeah, it's an input.
Yeah.
So that, but thinking about the static only thing, just okay, I have to put the numbers in that. Oh, no, but this and
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So we were focusing on the idea of a hierarchical component structure. So we created, the first component we created was hierarchy. which is-
All right, so like this whole thing,
Yeah, the whole thing. And-
right?
Right, so would that be at the top of the hierarchy and then?
Yeah.
That's what.
So I'm gonna put that up like here, because it's easier for me. Right, if we had a calculator and then we've got other stuff inside of that, right? You were thinking of hierarchically? So what went like inside of a calculator?
Not the first block where the zero, where the answer appears, that is.
Did you have a name? You don't have to. I mean,
Just wait.
we could. Yeah, I like display. So let's maybe call that the display, right?
And the little buttons that
But the display is also the result. Like where so the display is the display of the input of the user, but it's also when you hit equal,
Right.
it's also.
It's where results will go. Yeah.
So it's another component, but it's same area, so I don't know how to.
Right.
That was a question we had. How do you distinguish between, you can use like row.
So that gets back to, and there's again, a lot of this is not right or wrong. It's just something to get used to practicing and thinking about how to break stuff down. And so what I'm hearing a lot of right now that is good because you're trying to think of the whole problem, but also shows probably trying to think beyond the scope of like just what you need to solve first, is there's a lot of thought being said about what happens when things take place. Like, oh, when we hit this, like we hit the equal button and the results go here and all of that, right? But before you can even get there, it's useful to just, and that goes back to even the, you know, their documentation, which is like build a static version or think about these, break it down into a component hierarchy. And at that point, you're not thinking necessarily about what it means to take an action. You're just thinking of what are these, a lot of times these UI pieces that it's made of. And that may mean that they represent different pieces of data at different points in time, but what am I just like composing this of? So I'm, like I said, there's not right or wrong. That's just a useful, like, it's useful to constrain yourself. So that gets back to that statement I was talking about the other day of it's easy to try and solve the whole problem at one point in time, right? Because you're already thinking ahead, like, well, we know we're gonna have to have input, and we know when they hit equals, something changes here, and how are these connected, and how do I handle that, right? And the best thing you can do to learn how to become better at coding is to learn to limit the scope of what you're trying to solve at any point in time, so that you can say like, I don't know how any of that's going to happen yet. All I'm worried about is how I render this statically and what my building blocks are. And then I'm going to figure that other piece out next because it's too much. The truth is, for me, like, some developers are really good. They can think about that whole thing all at the same time. Like, okay, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I'm putting all the state in, blah, 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 and it gets working. I can't do that. I can't hold all that in my head. I have to break it down into smaller pieces or I get lost and just go around in circles forever thinking about it all. So that's for me, right? So it could be display, it could be called something else. You know, it could just be like, could be called results. It could be called whatever. It doesn't matter. Did you guys have other like pieces that you broke stuff down to, or is that where you reached?
Everything else
Was just a row? So you had rows? Yeah.
So we also talk about those buttons for maximizing, minimizing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I was sort of skipping over those because those are really from the you know, the Mac, and this is more just talking about the other bits. But yeah, those exist. That's a good thought. You know, something you would definitely consider if you were looking at that whole page. Yeah.
How about the color orange on the right keys? Would that be like a dome function where you just change the color of that section? So then does that mean you have to have this being a separate property?
That's a good question. I'm gonna put something down to maybe, like, I need to jot these things down to try and, whoa, that is ginormous. All right. Where's my class notes here? So, I mean, those are, I think that's a great question. There's not going to be just an immediate answer to that right now. We can talk more about ways you could do some of that or different ways. Like, so here's, I mean, I can give my stab, and I will tell you guys, I haven't thought through this until now, right? So there's gonna be some stuff that I think probably be like non-optimal to the strategy I would take as well. But I'm probably tackling something close to the way that Daisy was thinking about it, at least. So I'm looking at this thing as like, here's my calculator. And then me personally, and it may be too much, like maybe there's more to this than I need, but then I'm probably thinking like, here's my keyboard. Like it's holding all of my buttons or something. I don't know if necessarily you end up needing a keyboard, but it's just me thinking about it and trying to break stuff down. And then I would definitely end up with stuff like, we've got rows, you know, in the keyboard or whatever, like a row. So, you know, breaking stuff down, like if I'm thinking of something hierarchically, I've got a keyboard, and keyboard has rows, and a row looks like it has, you know, buttons, right? So I'm pluralizing some of these because really, you know, like I'm going to change this syntax just a tiny bit. Sort of implied this is an array of rows, or an array of like a group of them, so that I'm giving it more like the name of what would be the components if we were building these out, right? But that doesn't mean that that's where you stop, because people notice, like what else was noticed here? We didn't just have, we've already talked about it, right? We didn't have just one kind of button, right? It looked like there were.
And we're talking about numbers and operators. Thinking about a single possibility thing, like, okay, so each operator does different things within the keyboard.
Right. Right. We had like maybe we have something that's different between a number button. I don't know.
Yeah.
And we could break it down a lot of different ways. We could have an operator button.
And then we put some like function buttons for percentage and.
Right.
How do you say VAT?
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, because I don't know.
I have no clue what it is. The button you hit to clear the key, the calculator.
Yeah.
All clear might be what it stands for. I don't know.
I think it's called clear.
Yeah, I don't know. That's all I got.
That would be cool if it was.
You know, or you know, an alternative here is we could think about them that way, but we could also think about them, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be different components, but we can think about them in a different way where we could say we have buttons, but then some variations of them include the color appears to be something that changes for the buttons, or the width changes because the 0 button is wider, right? And so that would be a different way to think about some of that, right? And again, getting this sort of getting to this point of all we're doing is rendering this bit of UI. We haven't yet hooked up any of the functionality to it. So if you're thinking just what does it take for me to render the UI, not like functionally what makes this button different than this button when I do something, then it probably at that point makes more sense to think about them like, oh, I've got a button and what varies is my color and width, not what they're going to do, right? However, again, this will change when we start talking about actually adding function to things, and we may want to vary based off function, but we might also see that we don't need to do that quite at the level that we're thinking, right? So what do we think? Was this, I mean, do you guys feel like you got something out of trying to break this down a little bit? Thinking about how to break down a UI. I mean, a calculator is pretty complex. There's a lot going on, right? In reality, you think at first like, oh, a calculator is really simple. And then, like I was saying before, then you try and write it, and you realize, oh no, I can only put one dot in and I can't put another dot in, and that's trickier to code than I thought it would be. So hard. How do I handle negative numbers correctly? I can make it a negative number if I put like negative at the beginning, but I can't if I do a negative later. Anyways, so even stuff that looks simple can be hard, right? So let's do at least one more of these and keep it with something else that's pretty simple, and then we might have some other ones that might be like sort of homework problems to try and work through. So I think I've got a few options here. I think this one isn't too bad. What? This one's too much?
No, the other one that.
Oh, this guy here? Oh, we would just talk about the keyboard if we did that, which I think might be really cool. We might build something out that can do this. Can play like music. You can do that pretty easily with some React stuff. So maybe we'll do that in one of our classes if people are, that's the type of stuff I'm trying to get from you. If you're interested in like that, we might be able to do it. There might be a really easy way to have you build out a little musical app in React, or even something very basic game-like, or things like that. But let's do the same sort of thing, split up into groups, and let's try and build like, what are the pieces of this UI? And I'm going to run it a bit so that you can see a couple of the pieces that you didn't see originally. So there's not too much here still. Again, don't think of the actions. Don't think of how are you going to have those actions work and what's going to happen.
Computer.
Yeah.
Let's break it down.
Just think about what are these individual pieces and how would you break this down if you're trying to render this state right here. Not something more than that, just that state right there. What building blocks, what components would you want to use to render this? And let's give that, what do we got? Let's go till 8, is that too long? And then we'll see if people get done earlier, you can let me know if you feel like you finished earlier, and then we'll work through that. And if so, we'll spend a little bit of time maybe playing with some styling and talking about how you can do some of that in React apps at the end of the class. But let's aim for 8. So that's like 13 minutes to talk about this, try and play with it, break it down. Yeah, have at it.
Sort of think that you could just use it.
I don't know, I was thinking like,
Yeah.
you have a big square thing, small square, and people.
Yeah, got it. Right? Those are the same size, right?
Yeah. We already know.
I guess what's the name that we want to be white?
Each lab, each row. All the components.
Yeah, something like that.
Border actions.
Then we have the buttons, header, something, buttons here, like.
Oh, yeah.
Buttons, something. Not each button, button.
Button group. Is there a way to like, in that group, within that you have columns.
Yeah, you can see that inside the group. So within the button group, you want to have,
And then you have.
one and you have red, and then green, pink, red.
I don't know about that first.
I did pink, I don't know, I mean, it's.
Do it against one.
So we can separate from five with color and then we have low. But no, we need another name. Rose.
Rose. Well, it could be more, right? Well,
Just say-
I wanna be rose
I say. So you have more rows, right, group of rows, and which rows you have. Or no.
Well, you know, we have titles.
Yes.
Right.
But those are types.
But they.
Yeah, but exhibits could be different ways of seeing, and I understand, I mean, yes, we were thinking about titles or categories and you think. So it's just, I don't know, could be two ways, we could just write it down, like, one way could be titles and
Okay.
results, another way could be fonts.
Yes, oh, yeah. Yeah.
But no, the results are involved.
Yeah, one is titles and the other one is results.
Yeah, sure.
Because what I think is that you want to change div, go straight to div instead of branch.
Yeah.
That's to the culture, because they're all like under you.
That's true.
Or then if you want to change one.
Is a. So you. To be
This is how I,
Row this, row that.
I think I would do
Yeah,
it.
pero en español tampoco.
Title is left.
Fila, fila, fila,
Yeah. Well, but I mean, that's what it calls for. Okay, so.
Pero sí, con gris, con that,
Yeah.
yeah.
So instead of building this way, you build this.
Yeah.
And that
Oh,
way.
no, no,
So instead of being raw, you're.
Ajá.
Was that?
Pero dentro de
Oh, yeah, yeah.
sí, yeah, raw, exactly.
Yes.
Para hacerlo así.
That was from earlier, so, this is not. Yeah.
So I don't know if it's easy to
So,
understand. Yeah. Estas son las dos opciones, una opción y otra opción. Después lo grande sí. Display to display.
And then why don't we do one like that one?
It's more scale.
Yeah, but you can always pass it properly. Just like display or painter.
then,
I know,
but
you
I would
started,
go
and then you started within whatever. You can always display photo or back.
yeah, I would put the button, button, and then iterate with the left. Now we're looking here. You have to go left, or else it's not.
Y ahí le pasa
Yeah.
Igual, son iguales, pero se le está pasando. Yeah, sort of,
Yo creo que sí que hay para eso.
and then,
I think so.
Sí, van a ser iguales, probablemente.
Yeah, yeah.
Total props.
This is what we have a table.
Sea
This has the button.
Total.
That.
These props.
Yeah.
pero sabe cómo es.
So,
And this one was not.
Tengo varias de acá. Heroes
Way
and
there.
Hero.
Right, the last.
Y the próximo, cada
Entonces
hero,
ahí se le va pasando.
acá lo vamos a
No,
así.
pero se le va pasando por eso, ¿no? Entonces, sí, ese sería Hero. Actualmente es la barata y se le va pasando los programas de instrucción. Y en una ocasión se llama esa, se le pasa a una
Porque los medios props tienen que definir cada uno. Es como una especie de placeholder por terminar. Prop siempre lo sacas. Sobre el list, creo que sobre el list, sobre el list. Esto es como una especie de template.
no se llama.
Esto es como un template.
Yo sé, yo creo que define la
Es una forma de escribirlo de hecho. Sí, siempre es una forma de escribirlo, no es que genera
equipo, pero no el que pasa el cierre,
Oh, that, you can right click.
entonces yo lo que
Sí, no, es verdad, es verdad.
yo lo que entiendo es que es
Can you check? You already know.
una
Yeah, this time it's different.
Yeah.
This time we're just like.
Creo que yo puedo pasarlo de chico sin necesidad de verlo así.
All right, I like it.
Fue John, Brandon,
I like
John, le dimos Hero, fue lo único que
Yeah.
pero igual esto llama a estos cuatro que están acá.
Yeah, we still need to.
Yo creo que había pasado
Yeah, show it.
en un ejemplo lo que le iba a pasar aquí no tengo nada
Really, yeah. You
Sorry.
right click that.
¿cómo lo tenemos?
Yeah, yeah.
Sí, porque esta era.
Maybe two.
No, I think it's great.
Eso quiere decir.
That's a rectangle. That's breaking it down too much sometimes.
I think Ferdinand was gonna volunteer.
Oh, I shut off that app. Boom, boom.
Well, we discussed it.
What?
Yeah.
See that? All right. All right. Feels like people are pretty much done. Huh? You wanna talk? You can talk from that back there. You can come up here and point stuff out if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah? Can I get your name? Because I'm really, really bad with names. I'm going to forget everyone's name anyways. But what? Diane? Diana? All right. Yeah, Wonder Woman. It's going to be an easy one now. Everything's about nicknames. That's how I remember names. All right. What do you got? All right. A couple times. All right. Uh-huh. Did you call that one thing or did you just you call it display? All right. The header and then rows. All right. I like it. I think it's a good way to break stuff down. I think it works really well, right? What else do we have? I know you guys had a great breakdown. Let's talk about it that way. What do you want to present? Give us how you broke it down.
Just went like pretty simple. So like you did, overall be like stopwatch. Then the display would just be like the total.
Uh-huh.
And like the time, and, like minutes, hours. It'll be like all under display. You would have like rows for the actions. So that would be the start, stop, reset, and then below would be the data, which would be
Then you had the data. Great, yeah. No, I mean, I think both of those are like great ways to break it down, right? You're starting to see, I've already seen just from the last one to this one, what I feel is a big step in terms of how you're thinking about breaking this stuff down, right? What these pieces are and what you want to reuse. So all of this is really close, really close to what I would do if I did it too. I'd probably do, I don't know, I'd do something like, I'd have my stopwatch and then I'd probably have 2 like times or timers or something, I don't know. And then I would have, yeah, like my controls or buttons, which has these buttons in it. And then like table or results or something. And that has like, just like you guys had like a header and like rows, right? So, I mean, it's pretty much almost the same thing. Yeah.
What about if you had columns? And within columns you have rows. So each column like this, flat, total, have rows. Is that too much to break it down?
Well, not necessarily. I think it's great to think that way. What I'm going to step back into the domain knowledge I have about the web, and thinking in terms of columns is not easy. Because it's not easy to, if you're rendering a website, maybe somebody else can correct me, maybe they've got a whole different concept of how stuff works, right? But let's draw something on here, and let's say we have a website, and I'll go with sort of what some people will call like a sort of golden, the ideal type website, right? We've got like a header space up here, we've got something over here, and something over here, and then we've got this body, etc. But it's not actually easy. Like in this body, let's render something that has some columns as well, right? Like our table. So in general, it's not easy to render stuff and say like, I want this to go in this column. Like, oh, I'm rendering column, because the web lays stuff out just going down as you render across. And so it's much easier to say I'm rendering row, instead of column. So just knowing how it works, it lends itself to thinking in terms of rows. And then that does mean, right, when you have data that it's really like all the stuff in one column is the same piece of data, that your rows will end up having to do more than like one thing, right? You do end up with a little bit of complexity there because it has to deal with everything in that row, even though it's different pieces of data, but that's a little bit of just what you end up having to deal with a lot of times on the web.
It makes sense because then you have to put something here on one loop, and then you have to put something here and something there. You have to refresh 3 times.
Yeah.
Versus only one.
Yeah. So it's not easy to lay stuff out in any sort of columnar. I don't know what the word would be. Yeah. It's not easy to lay stuff out that way. It's easy to think about rows, and you can do columns, but it's sort of a, embedded in your row bit. But yeah, that's a great, that makes things like the calculator actually a little trickier. I was wondering if anybody was going to think about that, like things like trying to do this calculator, especially when you start saying like, oh, this button here spans 2 columns. Like it's a little trickier than you would think right at the beginning, because you're thinking, I'm just putting some buttons in, just make it this or whatever, right? It takes a little bit of work. Like you're going to have some code in here. If we were trying to actually convert this into code, we'd have to have something so that like this keyboard, this layout, whatever this is, knew how many columns you had to start in some setting, and then each button would have to specify like how many columns it spanned when you render it, so that it would know how to render itself. So you'd have to be like, this is, you know, you might have a default, like if it's default, it's just 1, but then you have to be like, all right, this guy has to be 2, so that it knows to span both of those columns. And it gets really tricky if you wanted a button that spanned 2 rows. Then that gets particularly tricky to do with a standard web layout. Having something that goes across 2 rows but all in 1 column can be a challenge.
I know that you were gonna talk about styling further, but with the new CSS grid, it's actually you have different elements and then you can do it.
Yeah, I know that there's
It's different.
I know that with even then column stuff can still be a little bit of a challenge. But yeah, CSS grid does make stuff nicer in that respect. There's a lot of what? Right, yeah, you can tell it. You get a lot more capability there when you're doing something like that. All right, I mean, how do you feel good about breaking stuff up like this? I think what we're gonna do is try and have a couple more just exercises for you to work on as well. Might be more complex versions of some stuff to try and break down, you know, something like that. Maybe like this page or something, or like this little Jeopardy one. So yeah, I like you talking about styling. Let's play with styling for just a little while, and just talk about some of the different approaches that you can have for styling in React applications. And we'll dive into this a lot more. Let me pull up some Google images. Talked about this concept. This gets into this separation of concerns, a lot like single responsibility principle, where way to think about building out an application when you're building something is that this idea of like JavaScript is like behavioral and CSS is presentational and HTML is structural. And so you're slicing with these sort of horizontal slices when you're building something, right? Where your separation is between your JavaScript is kept separate from your styling, and your styling is kept separate from your structure or your basic architecture. And so that's a very traditional web architecture, but it has some challenges. It poses some problems that when you're just getting into web development aren't immediately obvious, but the more you try and build out large-scale applications using that approach, you start to run into them. And that includes things like, part of the reason that this type of approach is used is because, oh, well, we want to be able to reuse this CSS or something, right, across different elements or across different pieces on our page. But what can happen very easily, and I'm not saying that one of these approaches is right or wrong, but what can happen very easily with that is then it can be very hard to know where your CSS is being used or to track it consistently, or to follow what's going on, right? And also a lot of times, like your markup, what your HTML is sort of closely bound to your JavaScript or your behavior anyways, right? So if we went back and we looked at this calculator, and I know I was talking about just think about the layout, don't think about all the behavior, right? But everyone couldn't help but think about, what's my behavior? This stuff is bound to behavior, right? So when you guys were talking about components, thinking about them before we broke it down, you were thinking like, these are different components. These are like, operator buttons or operators. They do something different. And that was just naturally, you're tying that concept of what this looks like to its behavior somewhat, right? Not a number. Not a number. I divided by 0, I think. Not a number. So React tends to approach things from a different perspective, where the idea is that your component, instead of thinking of like the separation of concern being between your JavaScript, your CSS, and your HTML, let me see. I don't know if I'm going to get a good picture here of how to do some of this stuff. But yeah, here we go. I like this. So the traditional approach is this sort of separation like this, but React tends to instead encourage the idea of your components being your piece of reuse and where your separation of concern is, and grouping all of that behavior together in a component. And that's, I think it makes a lot of sense, because if we go over here and we start looking at our code, right, we've got our filterable product table, or even our search bar, which we're going to add behavior to soon. We don't necessarily have much in there, but it's really nice to be able to have the rendering of this there and to be able to just attach the behavior all in that same place, because that search bar is what it looks like, and it's the little bit of behavior that goes with it or whatever. So it's nice to have it all right here. And that's a big part of what JSX is doing, is encouraging what in many cases like used to be called bad like approaches to development on the front end. It's bad. Don't mix your templates in with your JavaScript code. You know, that's going to mess you up. And it's sort of a rethinking of it in that respect, where instead it's saying like, no, think about it as a component that you're building, and reuse that component in places, as opposed to reusing, say, the CSS or something like that. Which leads to, I think they have an example of some of that. Let me see here. It might be in the advanced guides though, so we probably won't go into it then. Yeah, I think I will skip it right there. But a big chunk of the idea there is this, how you're splitting stuff up being more of this component-based approach. So when we get into that and we start playing with it, that meant that there's been a lot of rethinking of how you're going to style your stuff as well. And so there's several different approaches. For anybody who's worked with web code and is familiar with styling, CSS or using classes is still a perfectly valid way to style stuff in a React app, and some people use that. We use that on my team a lot. We're using something called Less, which builds down to CSS, but we're still trying to build them out component-wise. So, a common pattern might be something like, if we've got our, let me go into our product table or something, and we've got our table that we're rendering here. You can add a class to this. The only special aspect of it when you're inside of JSX as opposed to HTML is you don't use class as your attribute name, you say class name. And there's a reason for that. Anyone want to take a guess? It's a little subtle. It might be hard to figure out. What? Yes, because class, which we just learned about last time, right, is a keyword in JavaScript. And so if you use class as the way to put stuff into your JSX, it could lead to some potential conflicts where it's not quite sure, is this the JavaScript class keyword or is it this JSX? So instead you use class name. And this notation, if you haven't been told, this is what's known as camel casing. The idea is like you start with lowercase and then like a camel, you have a hump in the middle, right? So every word that you put together in the middle is uppercase. It's known as camel casing. But yeah, you can add a class name, right? So we could add a class name here that's like product table, for example, right? And then we could just go over into our CSS if we want and style it just however we want, right? Give it a background color. I don't know if this will work, light blue, right? So give it a little bit of a background color or something, right? And we can do whatever styling we want. We could say, our width is 100%, so be as wide as everything here, and now stuff's all wonky. Because our names, these things must be being centered, but these aren't. So, we might need to change some stuff there. But yeah, you can just add whatever styling you want using classes. And that's perfectly valid. It's a common pattern. But usually when you're doing that in a React type application, you'll notice I did something that might be a little different if people are familiar with styling using traditional CSS. is I'm sort of tying this to my component, right? Like this, I call this product table class or whatever. So instead of trying to build out like a reusable piece of, like a reusable CSS class or selector that I apply to different things generically, the preferred approach is to try and box it so that that component is reusable and sort of isolated, and then move stuff along that way. And that way, if you change anything about it, it's this very self-contained piece. And that's, again, like I say, perfectly fine way to do styling for stuff, the way we do it on our team. Another very popular thing, and this gets, you know, people we're already up in arms over JSX syntax because, oh no, I'm putting my templates into my JavaScript, and everyone's told me that that's bad. So then the React community was like, well, let's just make people freak out even more, and let's go ahead and just throw our CSS in there too. Forget having it separate. So another very common pattern in React is CSS and JavaScript. And there's a lot of ways that this is done, a lot of different ways that it's done. But some of it is no joke, just straight up something like, I'm gonna make a separate object here. Let's make a product table style. And I'm just gonna make an object and we'll give it a background. And when you're doing, this is something you'll get used to. The syntax is a little weird. You notice it was a dash over in the CSS. Here I'm using the camel case syntax. React will convert it over, but only for two properties, two attributes on your component. And that's like the, only for the style essentially, right? So if it's applying style, it'll convert it over to be proper CSS when it applies it. And so you'll see that in a moment. But now I have to write valid JavaScript because this is actually in, this is JavaScript. So I can't write CSS where, you know, like when I had it, I could probably restore this. Like I used the dash and I didn't have quotes around this. Now I'm creating a JavaScript object. So it has to be valid JavaScript. So to get the same thing, I have to write it a little differently. But all I did was create an object here, a very simple object. And now I'll go down here to my table, and I'm just going to use the style attribute, which is a HTML attribute for that, and set it equal to my product table style. And I've got my style right there the same way, right? And this is for anyone who's like familiar with web design, now you're really hating it. You're like, this is everything I'm never supposed to do. Don't inline stuff. You never apply style on your elements. You always use classes because nothing can be more specific than this. So there's no way for me to override it. You're revolting. You're feeling all of the pain of what I'm showing you, right? So recognize that. Now, most of the time when people are writing their styling in JavaScript for React, they're not applying it as a style directly on the element. There are build layers in between. So there's a build layer in between where what you do is you write your styling in JavaScript. You tell it like, you do something magic that says like, oh, this is this bit of styling right here. And then as part of your build process, it actually creates a CSS file with like class names that it applies. So there's some magic that goes on behind the scenes to change that. And this is an area where I will say there's no, like, this is the way to do it. There's dramatically different opinions on which approaches to take for it. The general consensus is that it's a good idea to, you know, have your components be these isolated pieces, right? So apply your styling component-wise, but whether it's, you know, like separate CSS files, whether it's something else. And I think they've got an example over here of this, actually. Yeah, it's SNJS, right? So there's a lot of ways to do this, but I'm talking about this notion of CSS is composed using JavaScript instead of external files. And this gets to what I was saying, right? There's not one solution. So a whole bunch of people have built different tools to do this same thing and different packages that accomplish it in different ways. So you can see, we don't have consensus in the community about, oh, what's the right way to do this? Even among the CSS and JS bit, which is all one group. Here's all the different things that people are trying, right? Now, there are a few that have gained a lot of traction as the most popular ones. So if these are alphabetical, one of the most popular ones out there is this styled components approach, which is going to be even weirder. Now I'm going to add another level of strangeness on because you write this really super weird syntax. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not comfortable with this syntax. I still haven't sat down and dug through what's going on in JavaScript that allows this to work, because this is strange. This is like template literal syntax tacked onto the end of this styled.h1 thing that's applying styling and then producing a title component that you can then use, which is going to have that styling. You know, it's weird. You know, there's other ones that are much more like that's one gaining a ton of traction, but there's ones like this, like Glamorous, that's been around for a long time as a way to do this, and it's, you know, a little different than styled components.
In the real world, when you're styling the stuff you're doing, do you put like colors, like, okay, this is gonna be background will be blah blah blah, or you just put organization color background and someone has the CSS with all the style guide that the marketing people design or whatever, you know. So you don't have to worry about that. You just put
That is a great.
title color, and then someone goes to color picker depending on the side book, and okay, this is gonna be color.
That's a great question. That depends a lot on the size of your company and how your team works.
Yeah.
So I've been on teams where, yeah, you've got your style guide, and you may even pull in, especially if you're using a library that lets you use variables, or you're using some of the super new CSS syntax. You know, it might be like, oh, you go get our, you know, I'll say less, because less is this layer on top of CSS that lets you have variables. And they may say like, go get our less style guide thing. And then when you want to get you're setting a color, you do this, or you're setting something, you do this, right? But that's still, traditionally, the challenge with that is it still requires somebody to go to that style guide, to go pull that stuff down. Or if you don't have, a lot of places that have that, they won't even have something you can pull down. They'll have a style guide, and it's your job to go into your code and like, okay, I have to apply a background color that matches the style guide, and I have to do this, right? Which you can imagine how easy it is for people to miss something, to not follow the style guide, to not do it right. Very, very easy. Happens all the time. In fact, that's one of the problems with style guides. Like, one of the traditional complaints about some of them is it's like, style guides are great, but they're out of date and they're not something that I can just use, right? So that is where, in my mind, React really shines. Because instead of giving you, a lot of companies now, instead of giving, like, if you're building stuff with React, instead of saying, here's a style guide, they'll say, go pull down this package with our components, and then if you need a button, you just use our button component, which already has our styling applied. That's the notion of the vertical being the slice that you're working with. The button is the button. You use a button, and you get our styling. And then if we ever update it, you just pull down the newer version of our package, and you've got our styling. You didn't have to go apply that yourself. You're pulling in components from somebody else and putting them in your product and getting that, because of course the button is going to have the button styling for that. And so that's actually a model that a lot of companies or teams that have done React have moved over to, is like, here's our core components, build out of those, and you'll get our styling automatically without having to remember to apply it or check against the style guide or do anything else. Which is really cool. That's one of the benefits of having that sort of component-based model, is being able to, you know, distribute those things in that way. Yeah, you can get, there's a great, I think I have it bookmarked here, let me see. There's a great read up on that. Where did I put it? Yelp has a great read up, CSS in the Age of React. So I'll throw that up here real fast. This is a great post talking about like their challenges of getting everyone to follow the same thing, because they did that same thing. They were like, oh, here's our template file that you're supposed to pull in and use our style guides, but they found people weren't necessarily doing it all the time. And so they did exactly that. They created these set of components that people can use. So that also brings me back around. You asked a great question earlier about when do you use HTML? When do you use component? Like, how do you know what the difference is, right? In a lot of the teams, like what Yelp's done, which is sort of crazy, interesting, and we may get to this later near the end of our class, is the development teams building out individual pieces don't pretty much almost never write HTML. Instead, they pull in this Yelp package, which has things like text, a text component, and heading, and container, and button. And all they're ever doing is creating elements of those components. And the team that's responsible for maintaining those components is the one that goes down to the HTML. And there's a reason, like they've got a specific reason for that. They're doing style resets and other stuff to control it. But you can get some really interesting, there's some really interesting things that can happen if you never go all the way down to the platform, and instead you're pulling in something else that implements the platform. And so really, you know, we may talk about this more, but a really interesting example of that is Native. And Native lets you build native apps for mobile devices, for iOS or for Android, that actually implement native UI elements. They're not web like a lot of these things are, but you built it all with React. And the way it accomplishes that is exactly what I was talking about. You're using like a view or a text component, and depending on what platform you target, it actually does something different underneath. So you don't have to know what's going on underneath. You get to abstract that away, and then you can target different platforms. Now, it limits you a little bit, right? Obviously, you're limited to what abstractions they've provided you. You can't do everything you could do on the platform. But it does let you easily build something out that builds to native on different platforms, and gives you a lot of the native look and feel without having to write it on each platform completely independently.
That makes sense, because if you have like 50 developers or in a large company, software development company, you want them to be consistent in buttons that they present in each screen, whether it be mobile or websites.
And that's a hard problem to solve traditionally.
But if you go with this, everybody's following it.
Yep.
And if you change the way that it looks or the background colors, is that the background that have to be missed?
Yeah, they don't have to do anywhere near as much work to make it change over. They just pull in the newer version of your stuff and then they get it. So it makes it a lot easier. Yep. All right, I'm gonna stop broadcast for anyone watching.